Welcome back to another edition of Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement, and I'm here with Sally Campbell-Evans, our Pastor of Congregational Care. Now, if you're listening on the podcast, you can't see this, but Sally has brought with her some notes. It's amazing, the archives of notes that you have in journals and things from your experience. It is convicting to me of the things that I've definitely thrown away in my past.
It's not necessarily a great thing, but sometimes it's super helpful.
Well, good. It'll be great for our conversation today. And so to kick us off, in your sermon, you mentioned a person named Eboo Patel. Mm-hmm. And you have some notes from, I guess, conferences or places where you've heard him speak.
Yeah. The first time I heard of him, he was the keynote speaker at a college conference in Montreat, North Carolina, probably it was like 2012 or around there, 2010. And anyway, he's the president and founder of Interfaith America. And he worked on Obama's staff, I believe, with interfaith relations. But at the conference, he was really challenging these college students to get beyond the stereotypes, learn a little bit about your neighbors, especially on college campuses. And he challenged them to maybe start an interfaith group or even do a habitat build, interfaith habitat build with your campus ministry, which I thought was just a beautiful idea. If we're passing a brick to one another, we're getting to know each other as a helper.
Yeah.
We can have conversations too, like simple and ask, he used the word appreciative questions. Ask questions like, can you explain to me about why you wear that scarf on your head? But don't do it in why is she wearing that scarf on? Don't do it in an ugly way. Be curious.
Yeah.
Be curious about the world around you. So it was just beautiful. But he's the one that said there will be no peace among the nations until there's peace among the religions. And that quote always has stood with me.
Yeah, and you mentioned something else that you said about Islam and what they think about creation care. Can you share that?
Yeah. He was talking about stereotypes and how, actually, besides him, there was a Muslim woman. There were 3 or 4 folks on the panel, so it may not have come out of his mouth. But in my notes, it said, talking about getting to know another's faith tradition, and don't just think about the stereotypes. I think it was the woman that said the deepest expression of worship of God is service of God's creation, and that's Islam. Well, that's not the stereotype maybe many of us have when we think of that. So
that's beautiful, and I think that's helpful to think about the stereotypes. Maybe even as you're listening to this, you're thinking of stereotypes that you have about Muslim people or about Jewish people or about Christian people, And one way that interfaith dialogue works well is when we break through those stereotypes, right?
Absolutely.
So to hear that, because once you do that, I think you hear, oh, an Islamic person cares about creation care. Well, all I have to do is go back to Genesis, right? And wait, we have a good creation that's created, and God wants us to tend to that creation. And so what can we share from our faith about what does it mean to care for creation? When a stereotype about Christians might be, they just want to escape this world and go to heaven.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And, we all, Islam, the living faiths, the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, we have, some foundational stuff that's very similar. It starts off the same. So those work well together. And in a lot of our interfaith work here in Tampa, those are the 3 main tradition faiths that work together, although this last year we've been inviting, others have joined in.
Yeah, I remember my first year here on staff, I went to an interfaith thing at University of Tampa, right across the street. Mm-hmm. And it was my first time meeting humanists and the Baha'i faith. And it is different when you branch out away from the Abrahamic faiths of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity for sure. Because there, I just feel like a learner. Like I'm just like, I have to just listen and understand what they believe. Because it's so different, Eastern religions.
When you mentioned Baha'is, in seminary, I was invited to a wedding of 2 Baha'is, and they both happened to be blind. So it was fascinating. It was fascinating to get to know them, period. But I came back from that wedding, and I remember sitting in theology class and having a little bit of a crisis of faith, just because the Baha'is kind of believe in the universality of all religions. And so that was like a welcoming thing. And I remember thinking, okay, what makes how do we articulate our faith that is unique to us? And for me, it's the person of Jesus. But, it was just another one of those early experiences in my life that were opening my eyes to other faiths.
Yeah, and you said it made you kind of think about some things in your own faith, right? I think when we allow ourselves to be exposed to other faith traditions, I think it just makes our faith stronger in some ways and more examined. Not stronger and more rigid in that way, but just stronger in a sense of it's more developed.
Right. I mean, seriously, you can articulate your faith better when you're with someone who is different, right? You have to explain it. Like Ping Gonzalez in the hospital room.
Yes.
If you listen to the sermon, she was my roommate when we first had our first children, and she just had so many questions as a Buddhist about what is the Christian faith, because she was had married into the Catholic tradition.
Yeah.
With her
Yeah.
husband. So.
When someone asks you, what do you believe about this? And then you're like, hold on one second. I got to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, in fact, one of these other speakers talked very much about that, how we don't know how to articulate our faith. So it was a challenge to all these college students. It's not just mush. Mm-hmm. What is it you believe?
So, Sally, there's another way that you do interfaith work in the Tampa Bay area specifically with refugees. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And this is just a passion of mine. But I mentioned in the sermon that for a long time I've been involved in interfaith worship services, particularly at Thanksgiving. And so 6 years ago, we started one here in Tampa, but it's for refugees. So Tampa is one of the places that has received quite a number of refugees. They have maybe been in a refugee camp, some of them for 10 years, and they finally get clearance status and all the proper paperwork, so they're resettled in the Tampa Bay area, which is why there are many of them around the USF area, all kinds of folks. And so 6 years ago, we had our first interfaith Thanksgiving celebration for refugees, and we had 250 refugees come. And the restaurants, Burns Steakhouse, and all these lovely restaurants donated this food, and we had a beautiful meal. Of course, we learned that some refugees, maybe if they're coming from Congo, they don't like turkey and dressing.
Right.
So we've changed the menu a little over the years, and it's more chicken and rice or dishes or beans. But anyway, such a beautiful celebration of just this multicultural meal shared together. We would have an imam read from the Quran. We would have a Jewish rabbi read. I often have offered prayers from the Christian tradition. And there would be singing and dancing, and it's just a beautiful celebration. So if you want to know more about that, I'll be happy to talk to you. Anybody who's listening would like to know more.
Yeah, is there a website for the for that
not yet.
Ministry that does that? Okay,
there's not really. It's the Tampa Bay Task Force for Refugees. We work together on that.
Okay, the Tampa Bay Task Force for Refugees. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
awesome.
And it's going to be November 3rd.
November 3rd. Okay, great. So as we wrap up our conversation today, Sally, there's two things that I wanted to make sure that I touched on. One is a resource for you all who are watching or listening online. 4 years ago, my goodness, 4 years ago, our church journeyed through the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation. And as part of that, we did a podcast series where we talked to scholars as we worked through the Bible. And we have 3 episodes that deal with literature written by John or John's community. We've got one on John 1 through 8 by Mandy Probst-Renaud, where she actually talks about John 3 and walks us through that whole passage that Sally preached on today. We've got another episode 46 by Susan Hyland, which is on the next half of John, where we talk about the metaphors in John and the community in John. And then episode 56 is with Dr. Caroline Lewis, who you talked about today, and you're on that podcast. We interviewed her together. You were a little starstruck, if I remember.
I like her a lot. I've been to retreats with her.
Yeah.
She's lovely.
You're like, oh, I was starstruck by Susan Hyland. But anyways, and it was true. And so, but those 3 episodes, episode 45, 46, and 56, are a great way to hear a scholar talk about John and some of the issues going on in the Gospel of John. For instance, that language that you might hear in John of, quote, the Jews, can be really disruptive when you read it and sound really weird to our modern ears. But there's something going on there. And those podcast episodes can help you sort that out. So you can find that by going wherever you get podcasts, looking for the Bible Project 2020, and download those episodes and check them out. Okay, but the final thing I wanted to talk about is Christian nationalism. And I know that's kind of a buzzword today. It might feel like a touchy topic for some people, but I think it's important to touch on that when we talk about interfaith dialogue. So Sally, you also have some other documents here from a chapel that you gave about 5 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that chapel?
Yes, I think Christian nationalism is on the rise, and it's a scary thing. And I think if we compartmentalize ourselves and only are dealing with our own faith traditions, it's easier than to become more like that. Yeah. So as we cross barriers and get to know our neighbors, it can help break down some of those stereotypes.
It can sort of be an antidote to it, right?
Exactly, yeah. Yes. So about, 5 years ago, there was a spree of killings in New Zealand, I think it was, and 50 people were killed, and they were Muslim people. And so an organization I had heard about and found out about was called Preemptive Love, and they talked about 5 things that you could do this week to honor those 50 lives lost as a way to counterbalance it. And it was things like call your local mosque, get to know there is a mosque not too far from you probably, find out where it is, introduce yourself, offer to bring a meal, stand with them. On Fridays when they have their go-to prayers, some of those folks were anxious about feeling safe. Was something going to happen to them? And so go to your mosque and stand there with them and say, God so loved the world, right? But to be a visible presence of relationship building in your community in this interfaith, multicultural world in which we live.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful response to that tragedy that happened in 2019. The organization that you shared with us was Preemptive Love, is what they were called, and their website is preemptivelove.org. You can go there. They've since changed their name to Standing for Common Ground or something like that. But it'll actually dovetail really nicely with our preacher for next week, which is the Reverend Dr. Gary Mason. You may have heard him before. He comes and preaches with us about every 2 years. And Reverend Mason helped with the peace accords in Ireland after all the terrible interfaith violence there. So he'll give us a word about the conflict in Israel-Palestine, what we can do there, how we can be a part of kind of helping to maybe speak into that conflict or help bring... Yeah,
his organization is called Rethinking Conflict.
Thank you.
And it's just a beautiful, it speaks to all that we've been talking about in this whole series.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I realize we gave you guys a lot of content to consider, to check out. We'll put it all in the notes below, too, so that you can make sure that you can check it out. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.